Hello, everyone, and I'm excited to be here to talk about payments in restaurants, and we've got some great speakers here with us. I think it's going to be a great panel because we've got some unique perspectives up here on stage. We have the voice of the restaurants of the whole world, and then obviously we just heard from Phil, and then we've got someone who's creating experiences that are really centered around payments. And we had the opportunity last night to have dinner together, and a lot of what we talked about was what's come up today, which is, we're not actually here in this room to replace the magical experience that we had last night, sitting at a table, eating amazing food, talking to one another. But what we are here to do is to try and figure out how can we make these experiences better, and where does technology fit in? So I think one of the newest innovations has been in this space, which is the bill. When the bill comes, and what is that moment? What's that moment for a diner? What's that moment from a restaurant's perspective? And that's going to be my first question for you guys, which is, as you think about that magic moment, how do you balance the efficiency that we're trying to gain with mobile payments and then the experience itself? Maybe we'll start with you.
Well, thank you. First of all, we didn't have to pay for dinner last night, which was great.
Or lunch today, and I noticed all of you were on time, so that was good.
I always think of cha-cha when I think about my restaurants. It's like cuisine, hospitality, and atmosphere. Like everything we think about implementing in our restaurant comes through what's it going to do to the experience of the customer in cuisine, hospitality. And paying for anything can be like a blow to the gut. Paying your taxes, paying your mortgage, and even paying a check in a restaurant. And so the notion that you can remove that, process it away, or make it transparent, which I think Reserve actually does, is a positive thing, I think, for the restaurant experience, because you want people to leave a restaurant remembering that dessert or remembering the conversation. And so, we're very open to the idea of the payment as being a part where we want to not make that an important part of the process where the waiter has to drop a check, take a credit card, take money out of your wallet, and kind of separate that experience of actually having to pay for something right as you're enjoying it. I mean, we all like to pay for things that we enjoy, but it is sometimes have that space. And these new payment methods, I think, in a way, enable you to separate it a little bit and leave that dining experience at a higher level.
Yeah. So, Greg, why don't you talk a little bit about how you guys think about that last moment and the hospitality element and the convenience?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think when we think at the end of the dining experience, so much of that really ties out to how I, as a restaurant, want that experience to transact, right? I think most restaurants, from the restaurants that I talk to, very much think of it, that is, to your point, one of the worst parts of the meal. You take the diner, you whisk them away, and the whole goal is to have them leave happier than when they got there. And now all of a sudden at the end of the meal, you're in a situation where it's like, okay, now pay me. And it takes you out of that kind of that fantasy, if you will. So from our perspective, it was a choice to say, okay, great, let's work with our restaurateurs. Let's still allow them to have that moment to say goodbye to their diners, which for a lot of restaurants is a step for service. But also, let's more importantly tie it back to the reservation. The only effective way in my mind to make payment really great is to make payment invisible altogether. That's the optimal way of payment. If you do it right, then the restaurant then ends up with more time. They're not running back and forth to their point of sale system. They can say a more effective goodbye to their diner. And it feels like as if you were to greet somebody into your home the same way you would say goodbye to them. And I think if it's done in that fashion, it delivers a really great experience.
And a faster table turn, often you might potentially turning their tables quicker.
Yeah, and I'm also curious just how you think about kind of the operations of starting something like this in a restaurant. What you would think about that, or training from your perspective. How do you guys think about how that becomes effective in a restaurant?
Well, I think one of the key components here, it becomes options. I think if you look at the overall adoption of mobile payments in fine dining and tableside dining establishments, I think that we're still at a place where Joe Q is carrying a credit card, and using a credit card for a large percentage of those transactions. So I think as an operator, those options need to be left open. I think when you get into the integration of actually having a seamless payment transaction, I think other things come up. I think ownership of the token, I think that's a very important piece. I think that's kind of underestimated. I think that's a very important piece of the CRM experience, and I think there's incredible ROI to owning that piece of the puzzle and being able as an operator to develop applications and speak to, my potential clientele directly.
So there was a Cornell research that suggested that about half of restaurants will start to adopt some type of payment in the next 1 to 2 years. And so I'm curious, when is the right time, and how does a restaurant decide, Josh, when is the right time to try this? Or what have you heard from the restaurants that you've talked to on this?
Well, we often prioritize. We have a lot going on in the restaurants. We're opening new restaurants, so it's throwing a stone into the lake makes a lot of waves and creates a lot of confusion sometimes. But payment seems to be a thing that the providers are giving us solutions now that are pretty low in terms of the amount of training that's taken to implement them. So it's just basically finding the time. We think it's going to happen. When we look at the landscape, I think Uber has done a lot. There's something about Uber that it's a feel-good experience, and really part of the feel-good experience is not taking money out of your wallet. It's not doing that transaction at the end. You're trying to get out of the car or of a cab, and we think that it's a win-win for us because we think that maintaining that feel-good experience and the payment process helps us achieve that, I think. So we're open to it. We got to get to it. We got to layer it in, and we've been struggling to do that, but we're doing it now, actually.
Great. And I think that kind of brings me to my next question, which is, at what point does this become more than just like a cool factor and something that becomes a little bit more ubiquitous, like Uber's becoming? And I'd love to hear how you think about that specifically.
Yeah, from my perspective, ubiquity is a big part of that. When you want to deliver that experience every time to a guest, you have 500,000 seated dining restaurants in the U.S. In New York alone, there's probably in the thousands easily. Now, as a consumer to be able to, or a diner to be able to have that experience everywhere is hard, because that means a vendor then had to go in and actually deliver that experience within every single one of those restaurants. That's a challenge. I think by comparison, the more thoughtful way and really where we took an approach that we thought made more sense was, great, if we tie it to the entire dining experience, then it really becomes, I know you guys mentioned Uber, but there is an example there of then it becomes an afterthought. It's just part of what happens. I mean, I think if people in this room think about the last time they took an Uber and really the last time they thought about payment, you probably didn't. It's probably the last time you took a cab and you got out of the cab and you were like, oh, right, my cabbie's really upset with me right now because I forgot to pay the bill. That's inevitably what happens when it's done right. And again, it's got to be part of the entire experience to really make it ubiquitous. And I think we've seen examples of that where it does happen every time at that point.
Right.
My kids are very, the kids use it as a vehicle. My teenage kids like, oh, if you don't have to give me money, just give me a credit card on my account and I can pay. The education and consumers learning that this is something they can do on an existing product as opposed to Uber, which is once you sign up, you bought into it right away. A lot of people don't know that even in all New York City taxis, there's an app you can download and pay for your cab. I ask 10 to 20% of people actually do it because they're not educated, haven't learned to download the app and actually do it. But once you do, and I do it in all the cabs I go in, it seems to make it a better experience. So
That's true. I'm curious in the audience how many people have used mobile pay at a restaurant. I should tell you to put your hands down if you work at OpenTable or Reserve. So that is another trend that we're seeing, which is that the younger crowd is, if they've used this, they're 98% more likely to use it again. So I do think that that's something that.
I think that it's interesting. You talk about repeat usage. This isn't just a hospitality problem, right? You look at Apple Pay, and the numbers that I've seen in a lot of studies are showing repeat use that's in the 10th percentile, 20th percentile. It's about getting that consumer mindshare where that becomes habitual. And that's got to become to the point where every single vendor across any single business you might go into is providing that technology. And we're still very much at this early adoption stage where people, they do it because they want to experiment with it. And it's, oh, that's fun. I didn't have to pull out my wallet. And I think when you transition it to part of the process, it changes that paradigm for
Yeah.
people.
I think from my perspective, 'cause I deal directly with the merchants, I deal directly with payment implementations, and what we see across hospitality is we don't see our customers coming back to us and saying, hey, we've got to deploy Apple Pay. I mean, we've just got to do it. We need it tomorrow. We're not seeing that. We're just not, because the infrastructure required to do that is expensive. When you start layering out, a budget of wiring, access points, infrastructure that, many restaurants may not have today, and then the APIs and the add-ons to the existing back-of-house point-of-sale systems to hook all this stuff in, you're talking about a significant project with real budget. And I think, of all of the mobile options out there, NFC payments is a tough pill to swallow in hospitality because it is introducing a new piece of physical hardware for every server at every single transaction, which is the opposite of what we're trying to get away from, right? And I agree with you, but at the same time, EMV is a global standard. That is where other verticals are going. We'll see where it all kind of pans out. But there's definitely an analysis that needs to be made in terms of what does my actual liability shift look like in a post EMV world, because it could be 3, 4, 5 dinners at where we were last night, and I could be looking at that budget again, saying this is real. This is something I may need to take a look at, and I think that's what some people are looking at today.
Yeah, and from a restaurant perspective, I think thinking about adoption is pretty key. I think this room is obviously we're high tech, high hospitality, so it's not a surprise that more than one hand went up. But in terms of the adoption from the restaurant community, how do you think the word's going to get out about this? Like, how do you think about learning? How are you guys learning about these new payment technologies and different services like OpenTable or Reserve for payments?
We very conscientious about the guest experience, and from our perspective, the payment process is a big part of the guest experience. So we're seeking it out. But like you said, there is potentially this capital investment necessary in some of these levels. So we are sitting back a little bit on the sidelines, waiting to see what really becomes the one that kind of sticks. And it's not a critical element for us because we're going to get paid either way. But I think we're kind of standing by a little bit, and the implementation has gotten much easier now. So it's able to actually take on maybe a couple different methods of payment, and almost like a different credit card, it almost doesn't matter. You want to capture those people who are paying that way.
Yeah, I think also not to go back to the security discussion, but to look at, if I look at a merchant's compliance, right, the defining line of where my perimeter for data security starts and ends is with my merchant ID. That's really where it is. So the merchant ID defines the behavior of the compliance and the validation requirements from a PCI perspective. So I was having a conversation with a gentleman earlier today where payments are able to be processed through their mobile ordering application. But they have the merchant's MID, they have the merchant ID sitting in their back-end system. So by that very definition, they become an extension of the merchant environment. So I may do everything right as a merchant technologist, as a hospitality technologist. I've segmented my network. I've got all my back-of-house systems isolated from all of my customer-facing, my guest Wi-Fi. I've done all the things right. But if I've provided my merchant ID to that third party is now an extension of me. And that is the rule. That is not, that's undisputable. That is the way it is. So you've got to be careful on how these technologies get deployed. And I think a deep dive needs to be done on how the integration and how that data is being passed.
Yeah. So I think a lot of why this is interesting to us is because from a diner perspective, there's an element of magic there. And from a restaurant perspective, there's got to be some there. So I'm curious, what do you think about the diner magic? What are the stories that you guys are hearing? What are some of the reactions that customers are giving to the payments experience that you've created?
The first time I remember back to when I took one of my good friends out. We went to a restaurant here in the city, Aldea. It was one of the first restaurants we were partnered with. We got done with the meal and everyone kind of looked around at each other like, wait, what do we do now? Like, we've never done this before. How does this whole seamless payment thing work? And I was like, it worked already. It's done. We walked out of the restaurant and my friend, he turns to me after we walk outside and he says, I get it. And I think that's something that we as a community, when we look at kind of payments and just this entire experience, it has to come back to the diner actually having that experience for the first time. It's not as simple as being able to walk them through it and talk somebody through it. They have to have the understanding of what better is in order to know how much better it can be. And when they have that comparison in their head, then they can actually say, okay, great, I would rather take an Uber than a cab. And that's the kind of paradigm that needs to be made for people, but you don't know the difference until you've had the experience.
Correct. And if you want to know what it really means to feel good, you bring 2 toddlers to a restaurant and then try and pay. That's amazing. Yeah, it's like, whoop, we're out. So from a restaurant perspective, what would be the ultimate result that you'd want to see out of, let's say everyone adopts this, and what would you want to see from a restaurant perspective?
Well, I think we speculate that potentially the spend is possibly higher. There's less of a consciousness and connection to like what's being spent and what I'm going to have to pay for, because it's kind of done behind the scenes. And just kind of efficiency of service and turning of the table and taking that pressure off the customer, dealing with the other people at the table. We think it could significantly enhance that end experience, because oftentimes, we always say to people at the front door to say goodbye to people and acknowledge people as they're leaving, because it's often the end of the experience that people remember the most. And we think that magic can happen better if it's done through a payment system that's transparent.
Great.
And the other thing I would just add is, from a guest experience, I think, not to pick on Guy again, but he had some great points. From whether a hospitality merchant wants to build it or buy it, right? So there's all these great platforms that guests adopt. They come with the technology, right? They're looking to reserve, they're looking to OpenTable. And then there's also the opportunity for the hospitality merchant to construct something on their own and build an application and leverage their existing cardholder data and have their own experience, right? That's another option, right? Which I think is something we're starting to see too.
So I'm also curious to hear from each of you. When do you think we're going to be able to leave our wallets at home?
When Greg buys dinner.
Yeah, you're done. You probably don't carry a wallet anymore, huh?
I've got a funny story about that. So we had a diner that wrote into us and they said, I went to dinner the other night. I was on my way to the restaurant with my wife, and I was in an Uber, and I realized, oh my gosh, we got to turn around and I got to go get my wallet. And sure enough, he was like, oh no, I actually booked on reserve, realized that wasn't a problem, went, had his dinner, walked out of the restaurant, didn't deal with any of it, got an Uber home, and actually didn't bring his wallet. We've got 350 of the nation's best restaurants that we're working with, and that experience happens if a diner books with our service every time. And we have a belief that that's possible. It's just making sure that you tie it back to the reservation, so that way it's a mind share thing for the diner, where it's consistent every time.
I think there's, in most people's minds, at least in my mind, there's always this need to have my driver's license with me and have a couple other things in my wallet. I'm not sure the wallet ever goes away, possibly, but certainly not the need to have to use it as much as we do now.
I think the other thing, and not to be the advocate for the mobile application for a second, I think the other thing that is potentially disruptive with mobile applications is, and being sensitive to the fact that we do have American Express in the room too, is that you basically have an opportunity to reduce the credit card fees.
I didn't want to bring that up, but
Well, I'll bring it up for you. Because in the last 10 years, credit card fees have tripled in hospitality. And as a vertical, there's definitely, when you go to the larger shows that cater to large-scale QSR, what we see from our customers that are in that market is that those rates are just exponentially going up. And I think there's an opportunity to kind of ACH, and I think there's some other integration points that can kind of level set and kind of bring down the per transaction costs for hospitality merchants to a very predictable level. And that's something that I think is a third cost I would add to, labor and food. I would say that's a kind of a unknown.
We've talked about maybe having a day where everybody leaves their wallet at home just to see how far you could get through your daily life.
Right.
Get to Whole Foods, you could get to Uber, to a restaurant. So I'd like to kind of ask you guys what you think the future is of kind of payments and how you see this playing out in the next 3 to 5 years. What will be our biggest challenges? What will be our biggest opportunities?
I think the biggest challenge is education and teaching people that they can download an app and almost anyone who actually does it, for the first time, like you said, it's like it becomes a second nature to do it. And I think the biggest challenge is the education process, and through our industry, teaching people. And we're trying to figure out how do we educate our customers that they can do this, because we do think it's beneficial to the experience of the restaurants. We'd like our customers to be doing stuff like this, but the challenge, I think, is getting at least the people that are that are no longer teenagers, who probably understand it better than I do, that they can do this and it actually can enhance their experience.
How are you, Greg?
I really think it's a new era for payments. I mean, you've got this kind of convergence that's going on. I think if you look at really the dining experience, it's kind of what we've been kind of alluding to, which is great. Once people have it, it's going to be very sticky. You just need to get them through that experience the first time. If you make it part of the entire experience for a guest, they want all of it. They want that communication with the restaurant at every step along the way, whether that be through their phones, through an app, or whatever the case may be. All of that stuff starts to bring things like check splitting to light, where I can now invite my friends. All of that stuff happens, so you're not in a situation where, as a restaurant, you're looking at a server that's going, great, I've got 8 credit cards I got to process right now, and I've got to try and close this table out who's all trying to get out of here. If all those things come together in the right way, then I think you get restaurants that start to look at those services as really additive. They're a benefit to the elements of hospitality that they're able to deliver to their diners. And it all comes down to the blending of the two in technology, which is, can the technology deliver the goods to make those experiences happen on both sides? And if we can, I think you end up with a better dining experience.
I think to operators that have limited time, resources, and budget, right, and they've got to pick which, I've got to basically do a bit of a gamble and say, I believe these are my best bets, right? Because the customers, the guests are going to come in with the reservation, but ultimately there has to be an end-to-end integration, and that's the piece that's sort of lacking. And I think if you look at the traditional top-tier vendors in the space for point of sale and back of house, they're cobbling together and coming forward with mobile applications, but they're not where they need to be. And I think that's why you guys are seeing, why Reserve and OpenTable are seeing such, starting to see an uptick in activity and adoption. And I think until, we've got to level the playing field. I think mobile will take over once there's a seamless integration. And I think that is part of the issue today, is that it is not seamless for the operator. On the operations side, to aggregate all this data and really tie it all together, it's not necessarily seamless.
So I've got one last question, then we can open it up for you guys to ask questions about both sessions, since we didn't have a question session afterwards. There was an exhibit that Target did that I thought was really interesting, where they kind of represented the connected home. And so it had all the different technologies, and when you walked into the exhibit, it kind of magically all happened. And so I'm interested, particularly from your perspective, and Josh, from your perspective, if there was one thing that you could say you want to just connect in a restaurant that isn't connected today, what would it be? Where you didn't have to configure, learn everything.
I think connecting the customer's actual dining experience, what they actually ate or drank, to the reservation and the payment, it still seems very fragmented. And that kind of like connectivity to, I think there's some companies out there, I just met a gentleman who's doing this now, but kind of connecting the customer's actual dining experience to the reservation, to our database in OpenTable, for example, and having that information available to us.
Me too?
Yes.
All right. I think from the very first days that we started Reserve, I had a lot of conversations with our restaurant partners, and they said to us, connect the whole thing, because the entire thing is, and when I say the entire thing, I mean restaurant technology is so incredibly fragmented. You've got 5, 6 different pieces, and I know you had them all up on the board.
That's a few.
Yeah, but that's the interaction points that you have with, probably your servers have with your guests.
Sure.
Between table management, between point of sale, between marketing, between analytics. If you can connect all those together in a thoughtful way and have data that actually is not only secure, but is like real. I mean, you have a lot of different technologies that if you connect it together, it just doesn't work. You've got to have it actually be connected in such a way where it's done the right way.
From my perspective, what I see is there's kind of a struggle going on right now in the payment side from the vendor perspective, outside of mobile. But all of the major point of sale back of house manufacturers are all scrambling to kind of control the transaction because they recognize that that's the lifeblood to a recurring revenue business for them, right? Because this is a service that can be kind of bolted on. And I think that is extending where their functionality is going. From my perspective, the point to connect, which I would like to see, is the identification of me, the consumer, the guest, and the feedback loop of how my experience was in a way that is meaningful to me, that I can give back and, as I want to or not want to.
That's why you're on the panel.
That's what I want to do.
Any other questions? I think there's one in the back.
Noah?
No? Right here?
Josh, you talked about a huge capital investment in order to build the future of restaurant payments. Working with restaurants is certainly, it takes a lot of time and resources. And in order to reach that ubiquity in terms of restaurants and diners is going to be really, really, really hard. And restaurateurs want everything all in one thing. Like they want to see who's the winner that has the CRM and the reservations and the payments. So with so much to tackle, what is the right order of operations in terms of building this business and in fact in a way that the industry is going to evolve?
That's a good question. We have not really, we have not really invested in much technology to deal with payments. We have been kind of relying on technology that didn't require us to actually implement anything. So we've been anti-investing in equipment because we're not sure what's going to end up being the end result in all this. We're, again, playing towards providing the customer with an experience that we think is easier. But again, it's an obstacle for us because we are not going to probably invest in the technology to do some of the payment methods that are out there.
I'll pass it to Phil first.
So to me, this is a bottom-up approach. This is infrastructure. This is, looking at the rails that run the restaurant. Do I have the correct infrastructure to adequately onboard, as the operations team says, we're bringing this new service in. I've got a new plug-in for my back-of-house server. It's going to give me new analytics. How fast can the team adapt? And how are we going to deploy the software across multiple sites? And to me, the infrastructure, and that's our whole premise as a company, is configuration management at scale, is understanding that there is a major positive for an operator to be able to go to one single place to manage infrastructure, virtualization of applications, and integrated security, where you don't have to go to multiple tools, multiple portals, have multiple people on the team with different skill sets, that there is a convergence of all of these technologies into one single platform that can provide this whole experience. And pick the vendors you want, and at that point, you're kind of somewhat agnostic. I think vendor selection is an incredibly hard thing to kind of foresee and to look ahead at the future. And there's definitely bumps in the road. But without the right infrastructure, none of this is possible. So, that's where the alignment on budget and internal governance with operations saying, we want to do 7 projects next year, but you're not getting any funding. There's got to be some kind of meeting in the middle. And there's got to be a level set on where we really are. Where are we really at in terms of our technical capabilities as a company and as a hospitality provider? What can we really give back to our guests in the next 12 months, right?
I think our approach was to go to the restaurants and say, great, how is this going to best work for you? How do we align our interests with yours? We, at the end of the day, said, great, let's make this free to restaurants. So that way implementation is they're not thinking about cost, and then really it's about their time. Does this solution make sense for us? Does this solution make sense for our guests? If it does, then let's move forward with it, and let's make the training process as simple as possible so that implementation to the operation is as pain-free as possible.
We have time, I think, for one more question. In the front.
Maybe this is just me and I'm a stickler, but as far as reviewing your bill before you pay it, I've been to restaurants where sometimes things are charged that weren't served because it's so fluid and you're easily just walking out the door, you could easily be paying more than you wanted to pay, right?
Yeah, so it's actually something that's interesting. In the early days, we were thinking of it as like, okay, great, let's just have diners walk up and leave whenever they want. And so much of what we built was in working with restaurants, listening to them. And what they came back and said to us was, actually, we want an opportunity to say goodbye to our guests, as opposed to just having them walk out. And what we landed on was we have these check as paid cards. It's the size of a business card, and it actually gets delivered with the itemized receipt at the end of the meal. So there's still that closure that I think a restaurant wants. The diner still gets to see what their itemized bill was. So they can make sure everything looks good if they so desire, and they're able to go from there.
Gotcha, thanks.
Great. Well, on behalf of panelists, thank you very much for the conversation. And I'd also like to give a special shout out to Lauren and Maureen and the co-founders of this great event. I know it's the inaugural event of TechTable Summit, and I look forward to more. And just thank you for giving us the stage to talk about these topics today.